Welcome to another episode of My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelly. If you're a longtime listener, you know that most of our episodes are recorded with guests remotely, but today we are doing something completely different. In June of 2023, I flew to Toronto to visit Nathan Radke and Lee Kuhnle from the podcast The Uncover Up. From there, we road tripped it across Ontario to Ottawa for a visit to the Diefenbunker, the Cold War bunker built to house the Canadian government in case of nuclear war. Think Raven Rock or Cheyenne Mountain in the U.S. This episode starts with some information from Sean Campbell, the curator of the Diefenbunker, before Nathan, Lee, and I launch into a discussion about civil defense. Our discussion continued after the episode ended, and I have placed that information on Patreon for our supporters. Here you can find out what we would bring to the bunker at the end of the world, what we would do with a vault full of gold, and which two podcasters were excited at the thought of being locked in the bunker overnight. That one might not be too hard to figure out. Sean, could you tell us a little bit about who the bunker was made for?
So, Diefenbunker rose in Parliament in 1958, and he announced that there was going to be a continuity of government system created, that a shelter system was going to exist in the country. The exact details of that, it wasn't exactly disclosed, but all we know is that our site, the ground broke in 1959 and construction ran for about 2 years until 1961. The site was fully operational. At that point, the site was opened up for both military personnel and in the future as a continuity of government shelter known as Central Emergency Government Headquarters. And that would have housed people like the Prime Minister, the Governor General, high-level members of the government and the military, and they would have been in here to help maintain order and a semblance of continuity of the country.
Give us an idea about how big the site is. Like, how big is the bunker in, like, square footage?
Like an equivalent, yeah. This is an equivalent I actually posed to everybody else who works at the bunker because I don't think that question's been posed to us, but we never come with a concrete response. But some people did say, give a couple answers if you wanted to visualize. So it is 100,000 square feet of concrete, hand-poured concrete, over 4 levels. And they said that that's roughly a third of the West Block on Parliament Hill, is about the size of it. But then also the White House, but 1.5 times the White House, essentially in size. Because the White House is only 87,000 square feet, or thereabouts.
So it's 1.5 White Houses underground.
Yeah.
And how many people would have been in here?
So when the site was first planned, it was for about 415 people to be able to come in and operate the site. But it kind of varied towards the end because we did make for more space for dormitory rooms up on the 400 level. So people started using the number between 535 and 565. So in terms of that capacity, it was just anybody who knew, because you would have had MPs out front that would have, they would have checked you at multiple checkpoints. So there was 2. There was one with a gatehouse as you were coming in the approach of the road, but then there was also the actual physical guardhouse building. They would have checked you in. You would have come down the blast tunnel. They would have checked you in again. So they wanted to maintain that number, those were the people who were going to have to come in. So it was about that.
And what was the makeup of the people? I mean, they were people in government, people in parliament. They were military folk. Were children, women, men? Like what kind of range are we talking about? What would be the demographic makeup of the population?
When planners had initially planned out the site, they did account for about 110, 115 women having positions on site in a variety of positions, both within the military and civilian, to be able to continue the operation of it. But for the majority of it, it was male personnel that came in.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah.
What I'm really interested in is what would life have looked like as a person living in a bunker, 75 feet underground?
Yeah.
So what would it have looked like? I know you'd be going about your daily life, kind of running the post-apocalyptic world, but what would you be doing in your free time?
So in terms of free time, I mean, when you're not really thinking about what's going on above ground, I think that's the main curiosity I would have. But for the most part, these are people who would have been trained essentially, they would have gone through the paces, they would have done exercises for simulations of this. I mean, for the emergency Government Situation Center, or MGovCitCen, they used to have yearly exercises in the 1980s with simulated exercises over a week. The site would be closed up. Personnel would have been given scenario sheets, and they would have been basically said, this is how the country's going to run at this point. This is the scenario you're going to have. Essentially, over the course of it, you would have just had your main task that you were supposed to do. If you were a teletype operator, you would have been operating the teletype for 8 hours of the day. Outside of that, you would have had 8 hours to go have food in the cafeteria. You would have been one of the 150 people at a time that would have been rotating through the space to have your meal. And when you're not doing that, you would have done recreation. And then there would have been another 8-hour block where you would have gone either into one of the single beds that was in the 200 level, or if you were the Prime Minister or Governor General, you had your own suite to be able to go into. But for most personnel that came into the space, there was bunk beds that were about 3 or 2 high, depending on the space that you went into. And you would have just slept and then rest and repeat. Same thing you would have done.
Doesn't sound like fun.
No, it doesn't. But it's that thing where you're one of the team that's running the country at this point. That it's a big burden, and that was the responsibility that you were supposed to maintain.
So they weren't allowed to bring their families?
No. You were the one who was briefed on exactly what your role was coming onto the site, and you could never share that with anybody. The most you could do is you would share with your family, basically saying you have to make your own preparation. Like, we would make our own preparations, whether that's a shelter, whether that's, doing a prepared route that goes to a place that's more safe where there may also be a shelter, but you had to make your own. The government didn't do any of that for you. You had to figure it out yourself.
I'd like to ask you about one thing, which is we went into a vault that was supposed to contain gold?
Yes, the Gold Reserve of Canada would have been in there.
Okay,
yeah.
so explain to me how that would have worked, because the gold wasn't in there. So where is it coming from? How long was that going to take? Why is it in there?
So there was a plan that was created with the Bank of Canada where essentially in like any sort of moment, like the Cuban Missile Crisis was one example where former personnel have told me that they were on site when the Cuban Missile Crisis was going on, and they said that the trucks were ready. Trucks and potentially trains, depending on the speed that you had to bring the gold out. They would have had it ready, and there was a train station in Carp, but then there was also like the highways and the roads were ready at any moment's notice for all of this to come out here to be able to bring into that Bank of Canada vault. It would have gone through the service elevator door in that space that was there, and then it would have been essentially palleted out and moved into that space. But the plan was discontinued in 1971 by the Bank of Canada. They just saw it as, they didn't need to do it, so.
How much gold are we talking about?
Depending on at the time, the entire gold reserve of the country. Not a Fort Knox worth, but it was still quite a bit of the country's gold reserve.
How long would that have taken to move that gold from topside down to the 100 level?
I'd have to check back on that, but I remember people talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the reasons that the plan was nixed was because it would have taken about 1 to 2 days. Because it was a significant amount and it weighs a lot. It weighs a lot to be able to bring all of that out there. You would have to have so much personnel to be able to move all of it. You'd have to have the crucial infrastructure to move it. You'd have to have utmost secrecy with doing it so that you didn't get robbed, which, a possibility. But Goldfinger did tell us that that's a possibility. But anyway, but it was crucial because there was this mentality about if that gold is irradiated, it's no longer worth anything. So we have to bring it somewhere. It can't just sit in the vaults in the Bank of Canada storage. We have to put it somewhere. So.
But would it really be worth anything after a nuclear war?
Again, as I said earlier on the tour, it's those hypotheticals, right? Is you don't know whether your currency is going to be bottle caps or, like Fallout, or whether it's going to be toilet paper, or whether it's going to be all sorts of things. But it's just, it's that hypothetical about what is that really comes down to that question of what are things worth at that point? You start asking that question.
But it is interesting to look at this bunker and see what people in the 50s and 60s thought was the most important parts of our civilization to keep.
Yep.
And it really was the government.
Yep. That idea of, because then that starts asking questions about identity and how is it that, what are the images of ourselves that we want to maintain in the event of that? And they came back to the government because that was the semblance of the political system at the time. Continuing to operate was the most important thing because that's, if you think about images of Canada as a democracy today, and that's one of our proudest images of the country, you'd want to maintain that. So
it wasn't about continuing our culture. It was just about continuing the government.
I think the basis of this whole thing is you don't want the structure to collapse. because the second the structure collapses, then you don't really have a country at that point. So having the government and be able to maintain that image and the mechanics of that continuing, whether it is within the mechanics of the site, it's like the site completely operates on a hypothetical. We're in a CBC radio studio that was never used for its intended purpose as kind of like the central hub of communication across the country. Right. In 1994, they did have CBC disc jockeys come down here and broadcasters come to do it because they knew that everything was going to be taken out the next day or the months after. So they wanted to use this space for what its purpose may have been, but the site is a hypothetical.
Welcome to My Nuclear Life, Nathan and Lee.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, Shelly. It's good to see you in person.
Yes, and you. I would like for you to explain to the listeners why you're seeing me in person and where we are right now.
You went on a road trip.
Yeah, and I feel like we are at the best themed place for your podcast. We are in Canada's nuclear war bunker or survivability bunker for the continuity of government. It's known as the CARP bunker, but nobody but the three of us know that because it's actually known as
The Diefenbunker, named after the Prime Minister at the time,
right,
in 1958.
And so we're in CARP, Ontario, which is not 30 kilometers away from Ottawa, Canada's capital. And we are sitting in the CBC room, which was the central communication hub for a post-nuclear attack world.
I think this is the best place I've recorded a podcast.
Yeah, not just because it's a proper recording studio, but it's a proper recording studio in the bowels of the earth.
Yes.
Closed in by massive blast doors. We had to walk through a blast tunnel to get here.
We are, 75 feet under the ground at the moment?
Several levels of decontamination shower.
Right.
A chute where we could drop our radioactive clothing.
Correct.
To be destroyed.
Correct. We've already been through the dentist and the open heart surgery center.
The medical facilities. We saw the Canadian version of the war room, or what was it in Dr. Strangelove?
The war room.
Was it the war room?
It was.
It was substantially smaller than the one you might have seen in the movie.
Less cinematic.
Less cinematic, but still so Cold War. So 1960s Cold War.
Yes.
With the cigarette ashtrays strewn about.
And let's briefly discuss the Prime Minister's toilet.
Nathan, why don't you tell us about the Prime Minister's toilet?
Right.
Both of these people got really obsessed with the toilet.
Because the toilet represents so much. If you only knew about the toilet, it would tell you an awful lot, not just about this building, but just about nuclear war in general. So they were anticipating that this massive structure, as big as it is, this huge Diefenbunker, they were expecting it to move around a bit. They were expecting the nuclear bombs that were falling would be powerful enough to shake the earth and cause earthquakes and move this entire structure. We saw that there were hospital beds that were chained to the ground to keep the patients from shaking around in the event of an attack. And the toilet is on a spring. Now, we got two reasons for why the toilet is on a spring. One of them is hilarious, and I think the other one is accurate. The hilarious one was, if you were on the toilet when a bomb hit, you would remain comfortable on your sort of cushioned, shocked toilet because you'd be bouncing around on it.
Which just doesn't seem right. Why would you be on the toilet if you knew a bomb was coming?
Well, actually, that kind of does make sense.
Really?
That might be where you'd find me.
Yeah.
You'd be taking a shit at the end of the world.
Well, because it's like, when the bomb falls, I'm going to be taking a shit regardless.
Right.
I might as well be taking a shit in the appropriate
You're
place.
Absolutely right.
So,
what was the second reason?
That the fixture itself would be damaged. It's made of ceramic, and so
right.
Putting it on a spring mounting would mean that as the entire giant building shakes around, the toilet would remain relatively unbroken. I think
that makes more sense.
That's the reason why it's on the spring.
It brings up, though, the point that there's been so much thought put into this structure. So much thought put into things like, how is the toilet going to survive a nuclear attack? And where are we going to put people's clothes who come in with fallout all over them?
Could we just talk one more thing about the toilet?
I don't think that we could be stopped.
I'm telling you, they're obsessed with the toilet.
Can we just talk about how they planned for the waste?
Oh.
So
Yeah.
these are flush toilets, right? So to me, my requirement to go somewhere is you need a flush toilet. So this place does meet that requirement.
Yes, this is why you don't camp.
This is why I don't camp. No flush toilets. So I'm impressed that they have flush toilets, no chemical toilets, none of that. But then you ask, where does it go? And where does it go?
Sewage lagoon.
Which is very close to a nearby river, so it's basically just an open sewage next to the bunker. And
Like,
yet,
imagine
I feel,
if there was like a survivor somehow who had struggled through the apocalyptic wasteland and they came across sewage lagoon. It'd be like, okay, I've seen some horrible things, and this is in the top 10.
right, that would be the final straw.
Yeah.
That's what
That's
breaks their
it.
spirit, right? But again, I find it funny that this is the thing that upsets you guys when
It's always the little things.
it's the little things, I guess. But I feel like we've got bigger problems if we are in a nuclear bunker taking a dump while the bombs are falling.
But do we? I mean, we're talking about civilization here, and there's some
Okay, I get it. You don't like
things-
camping. You need
but,
toilets.
But there's some things, like just the shred of humanity that's left. Like, we've evolved from throwing our shit out into the streets.
Yeah, but we're going to devolve to an awful lot of other things if we have a nuclear
Including
exchange.
Sewage lagoon.
Yeah. Sewage lagoon is sort of its own metaphor for what we will have
It
done
really
to
is.
everything.
Yeah, that's true. And it's also a metaphor for the de-evolution of our society.
Yeah.
Right?
In fact, I would suggest that if we do eventually pull off a nuclear exchange, we should rename Earth
Sewage lagoon.
Sewage Lagoon. Truth in advertising. I want to compare two things.
Okay.
I want to compare this building that we're in, like the immense care that was taken to try to save the lives of a small amount of people in the event of a nuclear exchange. So there's that, and we've seen it, the blast doors, the showers, the everything. It's extraordinary. Versus what the normal people would have been told to do in the event of a nuclear exchange through civil defense.
Right. And maybe we can do that within the context of sort of understanding what a nuclear exchange would actually look like and what that would do to the cities and the environment around us. Is the shelter system a feasible response to that? Is this a place that you'd actually want to be? I have in front of me that big tome that I know listeners of your podcast, Shelly, will be well familiar with. It's On Thermonuclear War by Herman Kahn. And he is, of course, a proponent of using nuclear weapons in extreme situations. He believes that an exchange is survivable, even if it's not ideal. But he has a very pithy way of putting things. And one of the questions he asks is, would the living envy the dead? And I guess that's something I want to maybe put in the background of the conversation, Nathan, that you're suggesting is sort of thinking about this bunker and the care that's put into it versus the civil defense measures that were given to the rest of us. And actually, who comes out on top in the reality of a real nuclear exchange?
And actually, Lee, what you've just done is you have undermined a lot of civil defense efforts. You have raised a very disturbing question. A question that is going to make people question the possibility of surviving a nuclear war. And the point of civil defense, as we'll see, was more about emotional management than it was about physically protecting people. And by asking this question, you have undermined my emotional stability. Because now I'm asking these questions, I'm terrified, I'm frightened, and this is the exact opposite of what they were trying to intend.
Because panic itself would be a potential weapon for undermining morale, and we build these civil defense structures in order to, have the public be confident that we are leaders who know what's going on.
Yeah, in fact, panic and terror were overtly referenced as dangerous weapons. Over and over again in the literature, coming from the Pentagon, coming from Rand, coming from all of these think tanks that were looking into nuclear war, again and again, they are talking about the dangers of terror. And there's a couple reasons why. One, and we've talked about this, of course, before, terror is a social contagion. And interestingly, it's almost like terror is similar to a nuclear reaction in that it's going to increase exponentially. In the same way that a nuclear reaction involves a chain reaction of fission, well, terror is going to increase exponentially as it moves through a population. It's kind of like a small nuclear reaction of emotion.
I was going to go through the brochure because the question is, what does the government and the scientists know versus what the public knows?
Okay.
And I think that's a big difference because the government is trying to control the panic.
Right.
Can you really explain to the public everything that you know and control the panic?
This is the question. Often people say the more you know about something, the less frightened you are because you understand it more.
But
is
I don't
that
think
the case
that's-
with nuclear war?
I don't think it is.
Yeah.
Because when you look at these brochures, so there's the one from the 1950s that is labeled, you can survive nuclear war.
Right.
But as bombs are getting bigger, it becomes harder and harder to survive nuclear war.
So why can't we survive a nuclear war?
If you're in the Diefenbunker or if you are a person on the street.
I guess I mean civilization. You know, like if, like, again, one of the shocking things in researching for this podcast was the confidence with which some of these theorists, like Herman Kahn, but he's certainly not alone, treated the subject almost cavalierly, almost in a way where it's like, look, I mean, he does say a number of times, it would be a disaster, we don't want this to happen, but then he follows it up right away, and of course, this is my paraphrasing of it, he follows it up right away with, but we can survive it. We can do this. We can manage. So as a non-nuclear physicist, as somebody who's not an expert in bombs, somebody who is actually just a civilian, you know, who would be getting these pamphlets, is it survivable for civilization? And what would happen?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Because on one hand, even I don't want to look at you and be like, no.
You're doing emotional management on me right now.
I am. Because I see
It's
the
my
hope.
sad eyes.
It is. I see the hope in your eyes, and I don't want to be like, yeah, no, we're not going to live. But especially when you say, is it the end of civilization? That is really hard to manage,
Yeah.
right? Like, as bombs get bigger, they become harder to survive because they destroy more and more of a city once they land. The radius of the fallout is bigger. The shockwave is bigger. The radiation field is bigger. So everything gets bigger and bigger and bigger, which means depending on where your bombs fall, destroys more and more of your country. But even if it is one or two, depending on where they fall, if it's a high burst or if it's a ground burst, it's going to impact our ability to raise crops. It's going to impact our ability to see the sun. It's going to cause worldwide devastation. There are people who have done a lot of calculations on what exactly that would be, and I don't know them off the top of my head, but it's not pretty, and I don't know that I'd want to survive that. So civilization, I don't know what that civilization is going to look like.
Right.
And I don't think I want to be part of it.
So that is a pretty bleak outlook.
It is extremely bleak. And I think the last time you guys were here, we talked about the nuclear war movies, and we talked about The Day After, and we talked about Threads. And I think that was one of the reasons why the public had turned against nuclear weapons, is because when you spend decades being told you can survive, and then these films come out and actually show you the reality of what would happen if the nuclear missile hits your country, what you see in those movies is not what the pamphlets tell you is going to happen. Even when you're in your basement, you have your 2 weeks of supplies. I mean, these are not equivalent.
You know what's fascinating is that those films, Threads and The Day After, they would have been catastrophic to the designers of civil defense.
Absolutely.
Because it's the opposite of emotional management. But I would make the argument that those films were actually probably more helpful to preventing people from being killed in nuclear war than the civil defense films were.
Well, wasn't The Day After a massive shock to Reagan?
Yes.
Yeah.
When he watched it? And even he was a pretty hawkish proponent of, Soviet Union is the evil empire, he says. And he was really heightening that rhetoric. And then he sees that film. And I also, in my research, noticed that I was constantly going back to the fictionalized versions of this to really grasp the horror in a way that some of these drier treaties, and certainly the civil defense manuals, were not at all able to depict. So what is it that the civil defense manuals were saying at the time? I mean, we are sitting in front of some. I have the Canadian version of it called 11 Steps to Survival.
And that, I think, is similar and based on you can survive.
Right. Sean, the curator of the Diefenbunker, was saying that the Canadian information is entirely based on American civil defense manuals.
Yes.
Okay. So we both have, I guess, the same version.
Well, I think the Canadian one explains the science behind the bomb a lot better. But there's one from the U.S. version that says, what are your chances? And I highlighted this because I think it's hilarious. Should you happen to be one of the unlucky people right under the bomb, there is practically no hope of living through it. In fact, anywhere within 1/2 mile of the center of explosion, your chances of escaping are about 1 in 10.
I don't like those odds. So things are extremely dire in the situation. Like, just to drive this home, I came across this just sort of by accident when I was researching into civil defense, and it's an account from a German priest who was in Hiroshima. And I just want to read this, and it is quite graphic, and so I apologize, but I think it does sort of capture a bit of the essence of what we're up against here. So the priest, quote, heard a voice ask from the underbrush, have you anything to drink? When he had penetrated the bushes, he saw that there were about 20 men, and they were all in exactly the same nightmarish state. Their faces were wholly burned, their eye sockets were hollow, the fluid from their melted eyes had run down their cheeks. Their mouths were mere swollen, pus-covered wounds, which they could not bear to stretch enough to admit the spout of the teapot.
That is so horrific. I actually feel nauseous. And of course, podcast listeners can't see this, but Shelly has her hand over her mouth.
Yeah. Now, up against that, what are we hearing from civil defense? And this was, of course, in 1945. So 5 years later, the American government would have known.
Absolutely.
Right.
this.
I mean, Hiroshima and Nagasaki come up a lot in the literature as evidence for or against certain procedures and policies.
And survivability.
But
those bombs are smaller.
Yeah, those were very small bombs comparatively. And so up against that, the American public is given film strips such as, of course, the classic Duck and Cover.
Duck and Cover.
And the absurdities contained in Duck and Cover are very famous, people covering their heads with newspapers. And,
Bert the Turtle.
Yep, Bert the Turtle. But you don't have a shell like Bert, so get under a desk.
You crouch under the desk. But if you're not near a desk, you go run next to a wall.
Yeah, but there was so many of these. There was Atomic Alert and Disaster on Main Street and Pattern for Survival and Our Cities Must Fight and The House in the Middle, which I think is one of Shelley's personal favorites. Have you talked about House in the Middle before on the podcast?
I don't think so.
I don't think you have. I think it's about to happen, though.
Oh, man. Okay, The House in the Middle is a way that the government guilted women into keeping a clean house.
In order to protect them from nuclear war.
Yes.
So the theory being that a messy house would catch on fire faster?
Exactly.
Really?
Yeah. And they actually did it with a bomb test. So they had houses. One was messy and one was clean. And then the bomb goes off because this was during the test site. And the one that was messy caught on fire and was destroyed. But the clean house made it through.
Yeah. I mean, the people in the clean house would not have made it through.
Fundamentally, it's your fault. Right?
Yes.
If your house is destroyed, it's your fault.
It's your fault because you lazy woman, you didn't pick up the newspapers.
Okay.
See, but that what Lee said, fundamentally, this is your fault. This was kind of an interesting message that civil defense was pushing out. They were doing this deliberately. They wanted people to feel like they had some sort of control, whether they lived or died, that the responsibility was actually on them. And they did this for a bunch of reasons. One, they thought that it would limit terror. They didn't want people to feel terror. They wanted people to feel fear. They didn't want people to feel terror. And there's a difference between those two emotions. Fear is a motivator. Fear motivates you to take action and to do things and to prepare, whereas terror immobilizes you.
Right.
And so if you get your population to feel afraid, you can push them in certain directions. If you get them to feel terror, they will feel nothing. They will be numb.
What were some of the things these brochures told you to do that you could take control of your situation and prepare for nuclear war?
We've talked before about a guy called Val Peterson. And Val Peterson is a really big guy in civil defense. He was the guy that came up with the everyone get in ditches at the side of the road. And then the guy who came up with, let's build giant cement tubes at the sides of all the roads, and we'll climb into those in the case of a nuclear war. So this guy is like a bigwig in civil defense. Well, he has this extraordinary article that shows up in Collier's magazine called Panic the Ultimate Weapon. And the argument that he's making is, well, I'll just read from it. What will you do if one day an atomic bomb blasts through your town? Will you take calm emergency action, or will you dash screaming into the ruined streets, a victim of your own horror?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to do the second
Number
one.
two.
Definitely
Number
doing
two.
the second one.
It might depend on how close you are to the blast, though, because if you're close enough, you're not going anywhere.
You're not running anywhere. And he
1 in 10.
That's true. And he continues. If there is an ultimate weapon, it may well be mass panic. Mass panic, not the A-bomb, may well be the easiest way to win a battle, the cheapest way to win a war. That's why military leaders so strongly emphasize individual and group discipline. War is no longer confined to the battlefield. Every city is a potential battleground. Every citizen a target. There are no safe areas. Panic on Main Street can be as decisive as panic in the front lines. Just as a single match can burn a dry forest, so a trivial incident can set off a monstrous disaster when the confusion and uneasiness of the population have reached tinder point. And I want to come back to the house in the middle now, because what he's saying is not only do you have to clean up your dirty house, you got to clean up your dirty emotions. Your emotions are going to catch fire like that dirty house is going to when the bomb goes off and you two go running out into the streets. And I remain exceptionally calm and collected, puffing on my pipe and
Of
wearing my
course you
slippers.
do. So what's interesting about this, though, is the language. And it's about we're at war, and this is about us being soldiers, about us being on the front lines. Over and over again in these articles and the brochures and all the civil defense, again, it's called civil defense. It talks about being on the front lines. It talks about civilian soldiers. So it really, really hones in on we're at war, even though we're not at war.
Well, the battleground is everywhere now. The front lines
But
is the
that's
world.
terrifying.
It is, but that's the problem. And so how do you make that not terrifying? We have to clean up our brains, according to these people. Now, I'd like to give you both a quick quiz. Okay. I'm going to find out how well we're all going to do in nuclear war. And this is from this article, and this is wild stuff.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to list a bunch of things that could happen. And there's a scale from 1 to 4. 1 means I'm not bothered. 2, I become tense. 3, it jars me badly. And 4, I blow up. And I assume he means...
This is a metaphorical...
I assume he means
blowing up.
metaphorically,
Yeah,
but...
that is a bad place to use
It's a
that
bad-
metaphor, if
okay.
I might say.
Okay,
so
I'm
just
excited.
One,
Okay,
one,
let's-
1 to 4, starting with someone crowds ahead of you in line.
1. Maybe 0. Is 0 an option?
0 is not an option.
Okay, 1.
2.
Hold on. Has the bomb gone off?
No, this has nothing to do with
Oh,
that. yet.
okay,
This is
okay,
just to
okay.
see how prepared
'Cause-
you are. If somebody cuts in front of me after the bomb's going off, I'm going to let them because they've been through a lot already.
Well, I don't know. I might be...
I don't know.
might
I'm a
be-
4 at that point.
Yeah, I might be a little more upset.
Depends what the line is for.
Okay, so let's
Okay.
start over.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, we should write these down so then we can actually add them up.
All right.
You got pens?
I got pens.
I
Okay, 1 to
got
4.
an iPad. That's not a
Can't
pen.
promise anything here. This works. I know that.
Okay. Can I write on this?
Of course you can.
Okay. So
Okay.
how
so
many
the first
questions are there?
one? Like 10.
Okay, so let's start over.
Okay.
So this is before. This is just our normal
our normal
state.
day.
Like
Yeah.
it's a normal day.
It's a normal day. This
And-
is to see how prepared you are.
Okay. Normal
when the bomb
day,
goes off.
and someone cuts in front of me.
Yes,
Are they in a car? Or are they on foot?
on foot. Like you're in a queue and somebody bumps ahead of you in like a movie theater line.
Oh, 2.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I up it to 2 as well.
So you both become tense.
It's a little,
I do, I'm like,
I'm a little irritated.
Okay.
I'm a little peeved.
I'm not sure if this bodes well for what happens when the atomic bomb goes off for both of you, but okay. But I
We
got
still
more.
have 9 more questions.
Let's persevere.
Someone near you talks during a movie.
Yeah, that's a 2.
Shelly's a 3.
I think I'm still a 2.
I'm also a 2.
You become tense. A stranger jostles you and does not ask to be excused.
3.
I'm a 1 there, actually.
You like
Oh,
a good
he's
jostle.
Canadian.
Yeah, he apologizes for the
Yeah,
jostle.
yeah.
I'm sorry I was in your way. You arrive at a station just after your train pulls out.
I'm a 3.
Huh. So that is, it jars you badly.
Okay, no, it's a 2.
2. You become tense.
I'm just annoyed. I'm taking 2 as I'm annoyed.
I think 2, though, is, to be honest, my natural state of being.
You're sitting at 2. Again, that's going to be a problem for Peterson.
Okay.
You were cut off during a telephone conversation.
Oh,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm relieved at that.
Yeah, exactly. That's a 1.
That's
How
a
about you,
0.
Shelly? What do you?
1.
1. Okay.
I'm just like, yeah, thanks. I don't have to talk anymore.
Your car stalls in the middle of a busy intersection.
Ooh, I become tense because people start honking at me, and then I'm like, what? I can't help it.
Yes.
So 2 or 3.
Wait, what's a 3?
3 is it jars me badly.
No, I'm still at 2.
I'm still a 2. I don't think
I've
it
seen
jars
you
me.
drive.
Listen,
Lively.
you having led into this with a description of seeing people after the bomb blast in Japan, I
It's
think
put
has,
things in perspective.
Yeah.
It
It
really,
kinda
it
does.
really has.
Okay, you see a spider crawl across your pillow.
That's fine. I'm a 1.
That's fun.
It's fine.
Oh,
Spiders are awesome, actually. I mean, I don't particularly want them in my face, but they're like super.
Shelly disagrees.
I once had a cat drop a live mouse on the bed.
That's less enjoyable.
Yeah. I tense up. I'm a 2. I'm like, ugh. I don't think I'm going to do very well.
No, you're doing okay. Your doorbell and your phone go off at the same time while you're at home alone.
Yeah, 1.
Yeah, 1.
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to move, do anything.
I'm not going to
about
answer
either
the
of
door
them.
or
I'm
the
not
Exactly.
Yeah, it's fine. And then finally, and this one takes a bit of a jump.
Okay.
You're looking at photographs of mangled bodies after a fatal accident.
1.
Really, eh?
Huh. That answer, I think, jarred Lee's back.
Yeah, I know. I moved my chair over a little to the other side. I'm between a 2 and a 3 here because
I feel like I should be a 2 after that reaction.
Well, no, I don't want to do to your listeners, Shelly, what has happened to me sometimes, which is, implant an image that is really horrific that they can't get rid of. But sometimes,
Like I did earlier in the episode.
yes,
Yeah.
and sometimes it has been accidents and things like that where it's been really tragic. And yeah, so I could be between a 2 and a 3 and 4.
Say round up to 3.
I'll say 3 on that one.
Now I feel like I should be 2 because I was pretty quick to be like,
Yeah,
I
you
don't
were-
care.
Yeah.
Well, it depends because we see that so often in newspapers,
Right?
So there is a blasé aspect to it, but I think if I can somehow make a personal connection, it suddenly becomes.
But if I'm just going through the paper and I just see it, I have no connection. I'm like, eh.
Well, that's good for you if that happens, according to Peterson. And also unusual.
But if it's like in person and the horror of it, I'm sure it's not going to be the
Oh,
same.
yeah.
But if I'm just like flipping through pictures, I don't have any attachment.
All right, and since he's asking us about pictures, that's the one we should answer.
Okay, good. So are we supposed to now add this up?
And now this part will be taken out because we're about to do math. So now
This is where Shelly shines.
This is absurdly unnecessarily complicated. If you score a 1, that's 3 points. If you score
Oh,
2,
no, really?
that's
Come on.
5 points. 3 is 7 points, and 4 is 10 points.
Okay, hold on.
Wait,
So
if you
one is-
score a 1, it's...
All of your 1s are 3s.
Okay.
So stupid.
All of your 2s are 5s.
Okay.
These are 5s. Okay.
All of your 3s are 7s.
Okay.
And all of your 4s are 10s.
I don't have any 4s.
No, neither do I. Okay,
we're not even
ones
done the math
are
yet.
3s. Why would this feels so like high school math?
No.
And this guy's in charge of civil defense.
Okay. And now I have to add all this up?
Yes.
3.
Don't do it in your head.
Sorry, that is me doing it in my head. I use my voice.
The voice is in his head.
Okay, just
Yes.
so your listeners know, I did it in my head and you're doing it on a calculator.
Yeah, because I'm used to
you're
calculus.
you're the physicist.
I'm used to doing problems without numbers.
This isn't even over yet. I've still got more math for you.
Oh my God. I'm sorry for all the listeners who,
Okay.
who
This will
played
get- this
along
will-
with this at
yeah.
home and are now like, oh,
They're like, wait,
forget it.
3 is 7, 4 is what?
Okay, I got my number.
Okay, so everyone has a number.
got a number.
That is not your final number.
What? I got to divide by 2 and multiply by 10?
No, you have to subtract your figure from 100.
Okay, that's easy enough. I can do that in my head.
There we go.
I can also do that in my head.
Okay,
but I
now-
have to actually check that my numbers are correct.
Ah, see, that's why I use the calculator first.
Right. So skip that step.
I was off by 1.
You forgot this one.
I was wondering why you had a higher score than me, even though you.
Because I'm better.
Yeah, okay.
Even though she's clearly more
Wait,
cool
that's a
and
5,
collected.
right? So plus 5 is 39.
39.
So I'm at 61.
61.
Is that my percentage?
Yes. Okay, so that's your score.
My percentage possibility of survival?
For those of you playing at home, here's how you can now judge yourself. If your final number is less than 50, which neither of you are,
No.
that means that you are going to freak the F out during a nuclear war.
Right.
Okay.
If you are 50 to 70, your final number,
Yep.
I'm 61.
I'm 60.
you're not likely to panic.
Okay.
Not likely to. 70 to 90 means you're panic resistant. And if it is greater than 90, you are panic proof.
What did you score?
I was panic resistant.
Which means your percentage was?
I had like a 72.
Okay.
So, all right. So,
Okay, so we could kind of go either way.
Yeah.
You and I. We could be like, oh my God, the world's going to end and everything's horrible, or meh.
yeah. So, a couple questions I have here. Do you think that this test, which again was done by the head of the Civil Defense Organization and was sent out to millions of Americans to do you think this is an apt assessment of whether they would freak out during an actual nuclear attack?
No.
It is something that Shelly and I were talking about a little bit off air, which is a concept that's very popular today, this kind of bro science, this fake science, the kind of quantifying
Right.
things with numbers, and here's a questionnaire with numbers, we can quantify it, but actually underneath it, it seems like nonsense to me. Now, full
You want some
disclosure,
more nonsense numbers? I got them.
I am not a social psychologist, and I'm certainly not a historian of social psychology of the 1950s and 60s. Who knows if this is actually legit in terms of what they might have known in that field at that time? But honestly, it seems like total nonsense.
Well, look at what nuclear war is being compared to. A spider.
Well, that's it.
Somebody butting in front of you in line, stalling your car. These are incomparable things. Interestingly, Peterson argues that 83% of American men and like 55% of American women
Are panic resistant,
can
right?
be made panic
Right,
resistant.
okay.
Wait. Okay. So the half of the population that deals with screaming, irrational children
Yes.
and men
Right.
cannot be made panic resistant.
Excuse me, 55% of them can,
But more men
by far.
can be
apparently.
made panic resistant than women who most likely already are.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Just making sure.
And so again, we see the same ideas over and over again. Again, this almost seems to go back to the house in the middle again, just sort of blaming women for the fiery houses and blaming women for the panicky populations.
You brave, strong men are going to have to protect me from my panic-induced state.
So this is the kind of nonsense that we're seeing in the 1950s from civil defense. And they know, that's the thing, like with duck and cover, with the house in the middle, they knew about what had been done in Hiroshima and Nagasaki with much smaller bombs. They knew what the war would actually look like.
So is this emotional management? Is this almost designed to give me a number where I'm going to come away from it thinking like, yeah, I'm going to be okay here? I scored a 61 after all.
Yeah, how did you feel about your 61?
I felt a lot better now that I know that, right? I mean, it's nonsense, but still,
I did feel better.
right?
Yeah.
I was just like, it's not so bad. I'm guessing he didn't actually try it on anyone,
No.
because if he did, I think he would have realized that the population of people he wanted to score well on this exam probably didn't.
I think the unnecessarily complex nature of the addition and like subtraction that you have to do is to make up for the fact that this is a pretty poorly designed test that tells us almost nothing. But that's not what it's for. What it's for is to do what it did to both of you,
Right.
which made you feel a little better.
A little calmer about the really terrifying realities. And while you guys are talking, I am going back to Threads and these The Day After and these other war movies, nuclear war movies in particular, where I am going to freak out. Like I'm freaking out now, sitting in this bunker, which was designed to protect us from a situation like this, and the whole research leading up to this. I know, Shelly, you live and breathe this, and I can't imagine how you do it, because Nathan and I are,
We're dabblers.
well, but we are in some pretty depressive
Yes.
environments, and yet this still took me not up a notch, I guess down even further. And the one thing I came out of this was a kind of a rage at the absurdity of these systems.
Would you say that you blew up?
Was it a 4?
I got much closer to being a 4
Sounds
after
like Leah's
reading
foring over here.
Herman Kahn than I
lots of
did
4s.
and watching The Day After than I did with reading the civil defense stuff as well. It's just, I don't know, like, I'm just emoting at this point. I realize that.
Which is the opposite of what you should be doing.
Right.
Because remember, we're trying to manage your emotions here. And it's amazing the degree to which this was done. It was done in the film strips, which seemed to say, oh no, there's little tiny things that you can do to protect yourself from nuclear war.
Can we talk about the film strip?
Let us face, without panic, the reality of our times. The fact that atom bombs may someday be dropped on our cities. And let us prepare for survival, understanding the weapon that threatens us.
Okay, so it's the movie that goes along with the brochure. And it was disturbing in a lot of ways because I watched it, I've seen it multiple times. I watched it with fresh eyes.
You watched it knowing you were about to go to the bowels of the earth in a massive bunker.
Yes. So I watched it with that in mind. And a couple things really stood out is that they talked about factories being our battle station. So again, this war metaphor, like making sure everybody knew that this was a war. Again, back to this fireproof housekeeping, that, you know, make sure you have a clean house, make sure everything is put in its place, make sure you stock up on your canned goods. Don't forget your tin opener.
This is good advice for when you were camping.
Right, yeah.
Or COVID.
Yeah, good COVID advice.
I mean, it's good advice, period. It's nice to have a can opener. I mean, just be the one to say the obvious.
One of the civil defense films is called Our Cities Must Fight. Which is just putting it out on the table, saying our cities are battlefields. And what's amazing is it opens with two 1950s guys having their 1950s conversation.
Smoking.
One of them probably has his knee up, which always happens in these films, has his knee up on something. But they make the argument that letting terror and panic take hold is, quote, close to treason, end quote.
Yes, close to treason.
Because it was motivating people to flee the cities and abandon their civil defense responsibilities. Being afraid is treason now.
Yep, fleeing to the hills was treason. And they equated it to Europeans taking to the hills during World War II and about how it clogged the streets and the cities for people fleeing. And so this is now when the government has decided that we should no longer be fleeing our streets, but you have to stay because we get missiles in 1962. And so land-based missiles are able to get from Russia to the US in about 30 minutes. So there's no way you can flee a city in that time.
Yeah, if you know the bombers are on their way, you have a few hours, maybe you can get out. If you know the missiles are on their way, it's because the missiles are there already, basically.
Right. So 30 minutes max. Our Cities Must Fight was ridiculous. Just comparing to the Europeans, just these visions going back to World War II. They talk about to desert is to throw away our power to produce. This film was ridiculous. And then at the very end it says,
Question is, have Americans got the guts?
Yeah, well, not for long. They're going to be vaporized.
the survival under atomic attack, the part that always gets me is at the very end when the father is washing the child's hair. And they say about how you have to wash the radiation off and, just soap and water is fine. And that is true. That statement is true. But it's the final kind of like punch in the gut, which says if the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki
had known what we know about civil defense, thousands of lives would have been saved. Yes, the knowledge is ours. And preparation...
But the American government knew that when those bombs hit, like Hiroshima and Nagasaki had civil defense mechanisms in place, but the estimates were that 70 to 80% of them were immediately wiped out in the explosions.
But it's not just that. They didn't know atomic bombs existed.
Yeah.
Nobody did, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that is really unfair to
Prepare
blame
for something
the
unimaginable.
victims of an absolutely new superweapon that they didn't have the right civil defense measures. But it, I think, also, again, goes to this notion of civil defense as a kind of placating emotional strategy. And I wonder, and this is a bit maybe coming from left field, but when we're talking about democracies, it feels like citizens need to have the best information available to make the best decisions because they're finally the ones who decide the policies. I mean, they vote for the people who then make the policies. So is there not something, I'm not going to get as hyperbolic as Val Peterson or these civil defense films and call it treasonous, but isn't there something dishonest and underhanded about, on the one hand, we know how incredibly destructive these bombs are, and on the other hand, we have these very placating, kind of condescending, patronizing...
And also putting the responsibility for your survival in a nuclear war, which you have nothing to do with, on you. Well, and on your wife or mom, who is, let's face it, let the place get a little untidy.
And again, the irony of them sitting here in this really amazing bunker, which...
Billions of dollars spent to prepare for the continuity of government.
Right.
When there might not be anyone left to govern.
So I have here a report from RAND, an organization that we have talked about before, research and development. They've done some wild stuff. So this is about the emotional impact of air war on populations. And they're talking about, okay, there's not going to be enough proper shelters like we're in here now. Mm-hmm. There's not going to be enough proper shelters for the population. The population is going to know that. They're going to be angry. And so we encourage them to make their own shelters. Now, they knew those shelters, let's face it, they're not going to work. They're not going to work to protect people, but they are going to have some very important effects. Right, so I'm going to read from it. Participation in this form of self-protective activity would contribute to the feeling that I am really able to do something about it. Moreover, if personal responsibility for providing one's own shelter is accepted, there is less tendency to place full reliance for one's protection on the authoritative figures of the government. Consequently, there would be less likelihood of reacting to apparent neglect on the part of the government with anxiety and resentment. After the homemade shelters are constructed, they may become an important source of reassurance. Awareness of their real protective value, as well as non-rational factors, for example, I made it myself, may invest them with considerable symbolic value as an anxiety-reducing feature of the environment.
This is... I don't even know what to say.
It sure is.
I don't even know what to say.
I'm going to go back to Herman Kahn, who thinks that, again, this is from Thermonuclear War, that civil defense measures are put in place. This will help morale not to be badly impacted.
Emotional management.
One of the things that I was thinking about in terms of what would a post-nuclear exchange look like if it really went down. I think one of the things that I would worry about from this perspective is the loss of political legitimacy. Now, I don't know. I can't predict. It could go either way. You feel attacked, and so maybe you rally around the flag or your community or whatever. But on the other hand, if this were the outgrowth of something like the Cuban Missile Crisis or just, a kind of a bungling towards a disaster, I wonder if that might not be another very big unintended consequence of one of these kinds of exchanges that is generally not taken very seriously by war planners. The morale would just plummet, and people would, I think, rightly be quite upset. And again, we enter this idea that civil defense is there in order to stock up morale. Whether it works or not, after the exchange might not matter.
I don't think it's going to matter.
But weirdly, civil defense, in a strange way, it makes it more likely that a nuclear war will happen. Because you end up with a population that is more comfortable with the idea of a nuclear war. And which is, again, one of the principles of civil defense is to make it ordinary. And it says that in the survival under atomic attack. It's like, it's not that different from any other bomb, really.
Really?
Really, not really. I mean, there's radiation, but you're covered in radiation all of the time. That's actually what it says in this pamphlet.
It does. I mean, which is true, but kind of not the point.
Right.
It's all actually funny, in a way. I mean, that's the thing about Herman Kahn. If you change the perspective reading him, it's a satire. It's like the guy is hilarious if he weren't being serious.
That's what all of this, just knowing what we know about the nuclear bomb, seeing the classified documents, right? All the documents that have been unclassified, and just looking back, like, It's just shocking how little the government cared about everyone else. Like,
On the other hand, as we sit in the bowels of the earth in this elaborate bunker that was designed to protect the government.
right, they only cared about themselves. They cared about the continuity of government. They didn't care about preserving culture. They didn't care about preserving humanity. They didn't care about anything except themselves.
There was actually a feminist critique of the Diefenbunker, this Canadian shelter that we're currently sitting in for the continuity of government, which questioned the very notion that you would be able to restart, continue civilization with a group of essentially old men in a room who might, now granted we're in Canada here, so we don't have nuclear bombs, and so they would not have directly started a war, the Canadian government. And yet, the critique was, you guys are responsible for this system. Let's keep the bunker, let's keep the Diefenbunker, but the top brass don't go in. It's going to be women who are of childbearing age and a sperm bank. I mean, if you really want to continue civilization, that does strike me like a slightly more reasonable plan.
I like it.
Well, I don't know if I actually like it, because the whole thing is horrible and horrendous.
It is, but it makes more sense.
It does make more sense.
I mean, it brings me down to like a 3 from a 4. I'm a 3 with the sperm bank plan, whereas I'm a 4 with the way things are now.
Yeah. I think what this points to, this discussion of gold and the plan around gold, is the confidence of war planners and people who are thinking about a post-nuclear exchange world, like, again, Herman Kahn, but he is at this point a stand-in for a whole group of people,
Yeah.
Henry Kissinger for a while, other people as well, who thought that actually a nuclear exchange was survivable, not just in the bare minimum sense of I'm going to be able to get through the day still breathing at the end of it, but in a kind of sense of civilization that, yes, it would be terrible and yes, it would be destructive, but it would still be something that we could survive. And I think, in a sense, if you're going to build bombs and if you're going to build shelters, that has to be the premise. And I think that's when you start thinking about, well, okay, so I guess we need to bring in gold for after the nuclear exchange, because we're still going to be running a society effectively the way it is now. Just
And we're still going to have money. Like, they're not
money.
reimagining society. They think it's going to continue as normal.
Right.
Also,
Exactly.
That's
they
just crazy.
can't imagine society other than capitalism.
Right.
Like, if you
Well,
don't save
again,
capitalism, you're not saving society
That's
anyway.
the whole thing here, right? Is that's why they built it, because we can imagine it. It's over there. We don't like it very much.
That godless place.
Right, that godless place. It is, I think, again, it's a kind of a mixture of hubris and folly and this overconfidence of the war planners that you could do something like this, and what you were going to come out with at the end is much like what you had before, slightly worse, but it'll get better. And so, yeah, you need a government, you need money, I don't know. But I think it is absurd, right? When you actually just point to it and you're like, okay, so you have a bunker full of old men and a room full of gold. That is...
It's Scrooge McDuck.
with the bomb. Out of all of the people that we have talked to, well, maybe not you, Shelly, but you spend your working days in a bunker. And I think you probably have a feeling more than the rest of us what it would be like to actually live here. What's it like spending every day, or every working day at least, in an underground bunker made for the survival of nuclear war?
I think about that question a lot. And, every once in a while I catch myself thinking about it. But it's just, when I first started in 2019, as I said earlier, it was, I thought of it from the perspective of a heritage, like as a heritage site. It was kind of like that understanding of from the historical aspect. And so when you have that perspective of history versus the modern day where you're interpreting the history and it's kind of more in today's perspective, you can keep that healthy separation. Whereas events like what's happening geopolitically with Ukraine, that starts to hit home a little bit more, and you start to ask those questions like, oh, that was the original purpose, and that's That's the feeling that would have been permeating within the space while that was happening. You would have had to maintain and continue the work that you were doing. Meanwhile, that was always in the background. And so, I will admit that there are days where you do think about that, but it's, you're able to talk about it with other people. It's like you're not the only one who thinks about it when you're going through the space. You talk to other people about it, and it's unique. It's very unique. I know that there's quite a few sites around the world that do interpret bunker sites, so then there's also that community that you can also discuss it with. But for the most part, you think about things that most of the normal population wouldn't think about. And you would ask questions whenever you're going about your daily life, and you're thinking about those things when you're in conversation with people that people wouldn't normally think about.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask, maybe following from that, are there things that you would like people to think about a little more, given your experience working in this bunker and having that context of history?
I think with our site especially, and the message that we always want to convey to people is that we don't want to make it so that people leave here and they're more running than leaving here, essentially. Is we don't want people running out the blast tunnel just being like, oh my, well, actually, no, they'd be wanting to run in for the most part. But we want people to know that the Cold War managed to end because people had debates, they had discussions, they were able to come across lines when, for a very long time, there was that us versus them narrative. And, there was always that sense of fear that at any moment, what is today going to be the day type thing. And then all of a sudden, the wall comes down. All of these Soviet republics are wanting to become democracies. And then all of a sudden, the concept of the Soviet Union itself just dissolves over this period of time, over the course of a year. And it's just, it was because discussions were had. People realized that the system was, and it's the idea that peace can be made. And if you just talk to people, then, eventually you'll come to some sort of consensus where you don't have to blow each other up with missiles.
That's a really surprising answer, that working in a nuclear bunker has made you somewhat hopeful about the future.
Yeah.
I like that.
It's a very good message.
I think we all need that, especially at this time. I think everybody needs to hear that message.
Yeah. Herman Kahn, in his book, says that policymakers are most interested in looking good before a war than they are in making sure that we can actually survive it. Do you think that the Diefenbunker is an example of that?
I think the site itself, again, as I had mentioned earlier, I think it was that hope of that policy and that program to be able to maintain the veneer government. There's a quote that I always think about when I think about the site in terms of the potentiality, and it was from, I think it was a German general named Helmut von Moltke, and it was the Franco-Prussian War, and he always had a quote that said, "No plan survives contact with the enemy." And so I think about that when I think about this site, because you can plan for any sort of eventuality, nuclear war being one of the most ultimate ones in our civilization, and whether this place would have worked or not, there's people who hope that it would, but I think that comes up with the reality of humanity is the thing that you have to consider with that.
Is there something else you'd like people to know?
Come check us out. Come to us. We're at 3929 Carp Road in Carp, Ontario, just outside of Ottawa, and we're open to the public, and we have tours. We have all sorts of things that people can come out and check out and learn the history. Yeah, no, it's a fascinating site, and it's not one that you'll see every day. And if you live in the Ottawa area, it's not that far away. So come and check us out.
Okay.
I want to wholly concur with that, because I've never been here before. This is my first time, and I think it's a fantastic site. It just gives me a sense of the worries and the fears of the Cold War in a way that I don't know if you can do it outside of a bunker like this.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to Sean, the Diefenbunker staff, Lee, and Nathan, who made my trip so enjoyable. If you are interested in learning more about the U.S. continuity of government plans, listen to episode 34 with Garrett Graff, who wrote the book Raven Rock. Please help us out by following us on your podcast app, rating or reviewing us. Until next time, I'm Shelly Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.